Welcome to the Sonic Collective, a music podcast that explores a different album or musical concept each month, diving deep into its history, context, and impact on the music industry. Join our hosts, Alan, Scott, and Darren Scott, that's way too many Scotts, as they share their thoughts, insights, and personal connections to the music, inviting you, the listener, to discover new perspectives and appreciation for some of the greatest albums and music of all time.
Hey everyone, it's Alan here with the boys, back for another album review. In following a trend that Darren and Scott Coates previously started, I picked the first album I ever owned for our January 2025 review. If you missed the previous episode where I tee up the album, that's A-OK. Here are the Cliff's Notes. In first grade, some classmates started a Beach Boys fan club, and in order for me to be included in that fan club, I had to be a fan of the Beach Boys. But I'd never listened to the Beach Boys before, so I convinced my parents to get me The Best of the Beach Boys Volume 2 on cassette. And over that summer break, I listened to that thing front to back. I learned all the words to all the songs, and I got back to the first day of school of second grade, only to find that those kids were over the Beach Boys and they had moved on to the Eagles. Bummer. But at least I had an early exposure to a great and seminal American band. Darren's usually the guy to give us the nitty-gritty details on these albums, so I'll try not to steal too much of his thunder, but suffice it to say, The Best of the Beach Boys Volume 2 came to be as a result of their label, Capitol Records, needing to act pretty quickly to get an album released in time for 1967's Summer of Love, after the ambitious album that the band had been working on relatively fastidiously, known as Smile, ended up getting scrapped. And so in a panic, the label just put out a compilation album and a follow-up to the first Best of the Beach Boys release, which had actually sold pretty well. So that is where we are. That's how we got here. And now I'm going to throw it over to Scott Coates so he can talk about what he thinks of this album.
Wow, thanks. To kick it off, I was kind of hoping I wouldn't, because this one, I'm conflicted what to do on this. It's sort of like trying to judge a Van Gogh, right? I mean, are the Beatles or the Rolling Stones any good? Yeah, of course they are, right? I mean, the Beach Boys laid the groundwork for anything that rock became. Can anybody, or has anyone harmonized better than the Beach Boys ever? Probably not. They're incredible. They're definitely one of the most important bands of the last 100 years, right? I saw that they kicked things off in 1961. The first big hit was Surfin' USA 2 years later in 63. I was amazed that this came out in 67 and was their second greatest hits record in just 6 years. Like, that's an impressive amount of singles, right? And I know things were different in those days. I think it had moved on to albums by then. Maybe in the Beatles' time, I know it was singles and then albums kind of became the thing. But your second greatest hits record in 6 years of your career, that's quite something. I found it also interesting that Pet Sounds came out just 1 year before this, right? 1966. And I think we did Pet Sounds on this podcast, did we not? I believe I picked Pet Sounds at one point. Yeah, I get a thumbs up from Darren there. So that came out in 66, right? And I know that it had lukewarm reviews. People didn't really like Pet Sounds at the time. So I kind of wonder, was this fired in there as a placeholder? The record companies were panicked, like, ooh, just released a dud of an album with Pet Sounds. We better get a greatest hits out there. I'm not sure. And there's no Pet Sounds songs on this greatest hits number 2, which is also interesting. And we all know that Pet Sounds, of course, came to be sort of their greatest album ever. So as you get into it, I mean, it's fun, right? The first song's fun. You get to around Barbara Ann, and I realize, man, this kind of sounds silly, like a one-word song that just sort of goes over and over. It's almost reminding me of like Lollipop, that lollipop, like it's just, I mean, it's one song with neat harmonized layers. I can imagine people doing beach blanket bingo to that. But then you get to ones like When I Grow Up, like super innocent puppy love kind of thing. And it also made me realize that, you know, Elvis really only started not quite 10 years earlier. So is this a bit of a bridge between, you know, the old lollipop type stuff or puppy love and big bad rock and roll with Elvis? Might be in that middle ground. And maybe that's what they were trying to do. I saw that Rock Around the Clock was 55. So like, I feel like a lot of these songs, they're maybe trying to figure out where they belong. And then Long Tall Texan, like, again, I almost feel like it's throwing stuff at the wall, seeing what sticks. I mean, it's a bit of a country song. It's neat. It's an odd bridge. I don't know if they're trying to capture more crowd, but it was neat. 409. I mean, to me, that's a classic Beach Boys kind of summer song. Happy Days, Greasers hanging out. I mean, Surfing Safari's fun. But listening to it, I thought, is something like Surfing Safari much different than like a BTS Korean boy band or Backstreet Boys tune in our modern day? Probably not, right? It was aimed at a kind of a teenage, younger crowd, specific time and feeling in the air. But the big difference, obviously, is that the Beach Boys wrote and performed their own songs, right? So we're talking about people that actually write and perform versus just sing someone else's songs. And of course, we know that Brian Wilson had a lot more going on behind the scenes. So, I mean, it's rich, it's layered, it's tough not to tap your feet to it. I mean, California Girls, all-time classic right there. I'll listen to that over and over. Help Me, Rhonda. Yeah, pretty good as well. And I Get Around. I find the last track, I Get Around, sort of really gets me in more of the Pet Sounds vibe. There seems to be a bit more depth and layering and complexity to I Get Around, which again leads me into Pet Sounds, which I love. So I'm really conflicted on how to review this one. Like, do I love all these songs now? No, but it's truly the history of rock and roll. Yeah, dated, is it like looking at a famous painting, The Scream, and going, oh, this is weird, or this is old, or, a movie like Doctor Strangelove and just saying, oh, this is old, it's black and white, it's crap. But no, it's a classic, and a lot of movies were modeled after it. And I think so this is maybe a very similar thing. And it's also neat that we're looking at the greatest hits here and not one album. So I think I got probably more jazzed when I was like 8 to 13 years old. It definitely is a dated kind of music and style of music, but there's no doubting it laid the groundwork. And it was fun to go down this musical journey. So I'll stop chatting and maybe I'll throw it over to Darren.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I think I share a lot of the same sentiments you do. It's a great album. Like the Beach Boys, you're right. I mean, it's always hard. And in this club, it's important. And we encourage people to use the context of the time it came from. So, I mean, they started in 61. All these albums would have happened probably before 65. That's when I think the Beatles then released Sgt. Pepper, which changed the whole trajectory of the Beach Boys because they were fans of each other, really. But it was especially Brian Wilson was, they say, near obsessed with the Beatles. And especially once they did Sgt. Pepper, he just thought that was the cat's meow, as they say. He really became transfixed and decided to make what would become Pet Sounds, which an amazing album. And what's funny, Scott? You just said, did we review it? And I just was Googling it while you were talking, and I couldn't find it. Is that like, what's that when you think you're in a different universe? I'm like, I could have swore we reviewed that album, but I couldn't find it on the website.
The Mandela effect or something, I think they call it.
Yeah, the Mandela effect. I'm like, I swear or maybe we talked about it once in a different episode or a specialty episode. But anyway, if anybody is on our site, I'm like, I swear. Actually, while we were listening to this best of compilation, I also dove in. I have a few albums myself, including Pet Sounds. And just the other night, I put it on late at night and just sat in front and listened to it. And I'm like, oh my God, it's actually a very, very powerful, amazing album. And like a complete departure from what the sound is you're hearing on the Best of the Beach Boys Part 2. You're right, Scott. I mean, they came in, they were pop musicians. Brian Wilson, his brothers Dennis and Carl Wilson, their cousin Mike Love, and their friend Al Jardine. That's the original Beach Boys lineup that most have known. Now, Brian Wilson has always been the creative force behind it all. He really wrote a lot of the songs. I know there was a lot of collaboration, don't get me wrong. Obviously, you mentioned this, but they were amazing musicians and harmonizers. Like, the three brothers grew up just doing that as a family all the time. Their family was very musical, so they were raised in that. And I mean, really with I think Brian Wilson's one of those, like, the border between genius and insanity with how he approached music, but he was a brilliant man. And even though they were, got successful writing pop songs like many do, they did really reach out and experiment after that. So this is a good smattering of songs that weren't really necessarily the number one hits that you would all know, but obviously most people know most of these songs because they were so huge. They had a lot of hits. But they focused in on this surfer music. So to kind of set context too, this is interesting, and I found out this cool story I'll share, was when they started, surfer music was in the popular culture, especially in that California scene. But if you think like the Hawaii Five-0 soundtrack, and it's just like guitars, they were all instrumentals. Before the Beach Boys started to do these albums, surfer music and surfer culture did not have any lyrics. It was all instrumental. It was really a different time. So apparently when the surfer crowd and that crowd first heard the music, they hated it. They said, they're singing. No, you can't sing in surfer music. It's supposed to be like the Hawaii Five-0 soundtrack. This is ridiculous. What are you doing? You guys are assholes. Obviously, the rest of the country disagreed, and that music spread like wildfire, and it almost caught in California last because the true diehards that were out of California and these surf culture people were almost the last on board because they didn't believe that you should have lyrics. So that's kind of an interesting story. Their vocal harmonies are tight. It's amazing. Like, you listen to this now and you'd think, well, they obviously are using all the best auto-tune devices. No, there's no auto-tune. I mean, yes, they would double track at times and use, I guess, standard or very archaic, effects. But really, this is just some really good, talented musicians singing their voices out. So I thought that was cool. A lot of the songs, I won't dive into the songs too much, but yeah, they're great. And there's a good variety on this. And I like that it wasn't all, I mentioned you'll recognize most of them, but I also don't think you'll recognize several songs on it. You'll be like, oh yeah, it might sound familiar, but there's a few on there that I don't think people heard of. And I like that. So I really like the album. I thought it was really good. But again, I think if you get into something like Pet Sounds that followed this genre of time, that was a real separator. One cool thing too, I mean, yes, they wrote all this surf music, and they're like, oh, the Beach Boys are all surfers. Nope. The only one that was Dennis. So Dennis was the drummer, Brian's brother. He got successful. He got a lot of money. He was a young, good-looking guy. He was the surfer, living the dream. And man, did he get into crazy party shenanigans. Like, this guy liked his drugs, his women, his alcohol, his fast cars. He was hanging out with like the biggest celebrities of the time, just had a crazy reputation for being just a party animal. He was often known to have a lot of STDs. I'm sure one of us will get into it a little bit. I don't want to get too deep. It's a different story, but he ended up picking up these hippies one day, hitchhiking, and actually this is kind of borrowed in the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood movie. If you remember, Brad Pitt's character picks up these girls and they take them back to this commune, and there's this character that's Charles Manson in the movie, but that is based on Dennis Wilson's real life. He really did pick up these two hippie hitchhikers that were part of the Charles Manson clan. He used them, had sex with them, partied with them all the time, ended up getting in tight with Charles Manson. He was also horrified of the guy because he was such a strange dude. He actually helped Charles Manson produce music. He bought and produced a song for him, which the Beach Boys released, which apparently pissed off Manson to no ends because he's like, no, the Beach Boys took this song and they ruined it, and because they produced the heck out of it because Charles Manson was such a horrible musician. But this was all through Dennis Wilson, and it was a crazy story. I mean, that's a whole other movie involved in that story. I won't get into it too deep, but that also, I like that, like when Tarantino does a little nod to things like that. So he takes these stories and weaves them into his own, and that was totally based on Dennis Wilson. So there is a whole Charles Manson connection, which wasn't good for the Beach Boys for a while. I mentioned it, I think, when we were warming up, but I saw the Beach Boys in 1989 in Parley Beach, New Brunswick. They always do this big outdoor concert in New Brunswick, and it was basically the original lineup, which was cool. It was one of the last times. Really, after the early 60s, Brian Wilson hated touring. He stopped touring. So even though the Beach Boys would tour all over, performing his songs that he would sing on the albums, he wouldn't sing in concert. So it's pretty crazy that, a lot of people saw the Beach Boys with out Brian Wilson for many, many years. He had a lot of drug and alcohol addictions himself. After he wrote Pet Sounds and made that amazing album, he kind of went down a bit of a spiral. You already mentioned Smile was supposed to be this big follow-up project, but I think drugs and depression and all of it got the best of that guy. But yeah, so in the end, I mean, this is really a great collection of hits. I think we'll come back to scores, but yeah, I really found it interesting. I thought it was a great pick, and first time we've really done a compilation, but it's great. Scott Gregory, what did you think of all this?
Yeah, so I grew up on the Beach Boys too. They were actually my first concert. I saw them in the Northlands Coliseum in Edmonton when I was like 10, which would have been like 1985. They were coming around like every 2 or 3 years at that point, actually. My parents drove in, and I was super excited because that meant we'd get to go to McDonald's in the big city because we didn't have one in my hometown. And it wasn't much later that I realized they were a legend. Right. I was like, oh my God, these guys are so good. Brian and Carl were still in the lineup at that point, as well as Mike Love. And they're actually coming to Calgary in a couple months, I believe. And it still looks like Mike Love is singing in the group. So that really kind of shocked me because he's got to be like 900 years old at this point.
Yeah.
I'm like, are they wheeling him out on the stage or what? I don't know. But, some of those guys like Mick Jagger and him, I guess, can sing until, they're pouring dirt on top of him. Hope he's not listening to this and taking offense to that. So yeah, I will go into.
He's 83. I just looked. He's 83 years old.
Wow. So that's crazy that he's still out there doing it. But do what you love till you can't. Some of the most notable tracks for me, I'll go through a couple in this collection because I really love California Girls. I wonder how many people know this from David Lee Roth, though, instead of the Beach Boys. Like, he launched his solo career on the EP with it, right? This song obviously inspired a lot of covers, copycat styles. Katy Perry is probably the biggest, most contemporary one. It is one of my favorite tracks from the band. It's got that catchy organ and bass line. It's easy to groove, to follow along with. And of course, everyone's mentioned the harmonies. I love bands that sound as good on stage as they do in the studio. And as already been said, their harmonies just can't be matched. I think of a group like, say, Pentatonics is the modern equivalent where, they could go a cappella for days and sound amazing. So if you're familiar with Pentatonics in the contemporary sense, this is basically them back then as far as ability to harmonize together, which I think is really shown on I Get Around. I think that really showcases their ability to harmonize. Like most bands, you can count on backing vocals from maybe a guitarist, right? But the Beach Boys had all 5 members really being able to contribute legitimate lead or backing vocal duties. But I contrast this against Barbara Ann. I know you spoke highly of it, I think, Scott, but for some reason that song just grates, or was it Alan? I can't remember, one of you. I'm blacking it out already.
No, Barbara Ann I didn't dig. I found it kind of annoying. I said it was just kind of like lollipop, lollipop,
yeah.
Like just...
Or tequila, right? Just one word. The great writing jobs, guys. I hope the writer gets paid. It grates on me, though, because it's harmony heavy, but it feels disjointed, chaotic. Harmonizing does not necessarily a good song make, I guess, is the lesson from that one for me. But my least favorite track was When I Grow Up to Be a Man. Like, suck it up, dudes. It's just so whiny from a lyrics perspective. It's teenage angst from that era, and it's really just as bad as this one. Like, I don't think I ever wondered when I was 16 if my kids would think I'm cool or not eventually, right? Like, of course I'd be cool. They'd be the lame Zoomer ones. So, geez. But Don't Worry Baby is a much more manly track despite being sensitive. Men can have doubts and need support too, and the love of a good woman can help you pull it all together. The harmonies, again, are great. There's a little story in there and a nice solid groove to the backing instruments. It was good stuff. But I think you were right, Darren, when you said there's a couple in here people won't recognize, because I don't remember listening to Please Let Me Wonder much ever, right? And we played a lot of Beach Boys in the house. Like, my mom was crazy for these guys. But, it was a nice, smooth little romantic melody, very Beach Boysy in that way, right? There, I think you guys are right when you say that they're kind of a boy band, literally a boy band from back in the day. And I almost picked the Monkees for my next pick.
Hey, when the Monkees.
Nice.
So I was doing a little digging into the boy bands of that era and who played their instruments, who didn't, who wanted to and weren't allowed to and whatnot. So you're right. These are standouts as far as playing their own instruments, doing their own vocals, doing their own writing. They may be a boy band, but they're like the alpha boy band. So it's pretty sweet. Oh, sweet, Darren. Darren's showing me a cover of the Monkees. Nice. More of the Monkees. Take the last train to Clarksville. Yeah. So, yeah, they're just really a groovy romantic quintet. You know, they're nothing too serious. They're just teen vibing, and I'm here for most of it. Other than, you know, the kid bitching on when I grow up to be a man, screw that imaginary crybaby. So with that in mind, I think you're right when, you know, I think the music relies heavily on the mindset of the kids in that generation and really speaking to them, and it doesn't necessarily speak to me. I think of like George Lucas and his response about the new Star Wars movies when people are like, I don't like this, it's not for me. It's like, exactly, it's not for you. It's for the kids, and you're like 40 now. So the Beach Boys are for teenagers from then, not 40-year-old me now. And I think it might be fun, you know, to put this on for a themed party or work some singles into an all ages dance party. They'd be pretty safe. But I don't think I'd put the whole album on again, right? Even though it's greatest hits. I think even on this greatest hits, I'd still be cannibalizing it for singles. But that being said, I already knew all the lyrics to like over half of the songs on this album. So I can't deny their influence right into the 80s and beyond as well. So with that in mind, I won't go into my scores. I'll throw it back to Alan, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, guys. That's, yeah, I think we're all kind of on the same page. Man, this was such a blast from the past for me. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of bias here because I picked this album and it was important to me in my childhood. But in recent years, I've really come to enjoy listening to music from the 1960s. So revisiting this album as an adult is a bit of a trip. And now I can understand and empathize with the lyrical contents a bit, which is something I wasn't able to do back, you know, when I was a 7-year-old, maybe 8, however old I was. Either way, I mean, like, just a 409 really meant nothing to me back then since I didn't drive and my parents had a minivan. All I knew is that it was a fun song. There is a word I learned recently. I don't know if I'm going to pronounce it right. I think it's Greek. Anemoia. Anemoia. And that is the nostalgia for a time that you've never known. Now, I'm a kid who was born in the mid-1980s, and listening to the Beach Boys has this magical way of transporting me back in time straight to the California coast, spending carefree summer days on a beach with my friends, right? Or at least that's how I imagine it or interpret it. I've never been to California, and I don't surf, and it's a cold January day right now here in Canada, but, you know, that's the magic of the music of the Beach Boys, I think. Like, they have amassed this worldwide fan base of people who probably also have never gone surfing off the Pacific coast, but because the band writes fun, catchy songs, it has a way of bringing people together. The Beach Boys were at their peak during the 1960s, and their music is really firmly attached to that era, like sonically. But to me, and maybe paradoxically, there's a bit of a timelessness to it. It's still fun to listen to. It's still evocative of a carefree lifestyle. Call it a sonic vacation, if you will. And I think that has a universal appeal that transcends geographies and age demographics. As you guys have all touched on, one of the Beach Boys' greatest strengths is their harmonies, you know, the richness and depth that you get from all of those voices coming together really adds a unique element to their music and really makes it easy to sing along to. And beyond the vocals, their instruments are really perfectly crafted to create that 1960s signature surfer rock vibe. And because this album is a best of album, it's of course going to be loaded with some of their greatest music, including songs that didn't get the mainstream singles spotlight, but are still a quality piece of work. For me personally, standout songs are 409. You know, now I'm a car guy, and this song celebrates car culture. Again, from the lens of a time that I was never personally there to enjoy, but I can appreciate what they're singing about nonetheless. Let Him Run Wild. Fun fact, this is Brian Wilson's first song that he ever wrote under the influence of marijuana. And apparently this song was what kind of convinced everyone else in the band that this guy is actually kind of a genius. Barbara Ann. Something that has always bugged me, even as a kid, I remember bugging me, how they pronounce Barbara Ann. Barbara Ann? Like, what are you doing, guys? Just pronounce it properly. Even though they can't pronounce her name right, like, it's still a fun song. I don't know that I agree with you guys hating on it. I think it's pretty cool. It is definitely sugar-coated bubblegum pop music for sure, but I like it. And lastly, California Girls. Indeed, I too wish they could all be California Girls. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pick a standout on an album full of standouts. These are all really solid songs, and I think even though they are evocative of, perhaps a simpler time, they hold out. To Scott Gregory's point, you could throw it on at a party, and I think you'd get people dancing to it, or at least people vibing out to it. All in all, like, the Beach Boys probably aren't a band I would listen to all the time, and, I certainly probably wouldn't put on a whole album to listen to, but there is a time and a place in my music collection for these guys, and I am sure they inspired the 90s and 2000s boy bands like NSYNC and Backstreet Boys, who I really enjoy as well. And I'm sure they in turn inspired the K-pop musicians of today. Just a really impactful, legendary band. And it's cool to know that they're kind of still out there doing their thing, even if Mike Love is 83 years young. Anyway, let's quantify this. I'm going to throw it back over to you, Scott Coates.
Okay. Boy, yeah, scoring, I just don't know if scoring's fair, right? Again, I feel like, hey, the Beatles' greatest hits, what do you think of the Beatles? Or like Beach Boys. Again, I think when we look at the all-time greats who defined what rock and roll is, you've got the Beatles, you've got the Stones, you've got Zeppelin, you've got the Beach Boys. There's a few others, but so influence, I'll give it a 2. Like, is it influencing me now? No. Did I listen to Beach Boys and sing Surfin' USA and lip sync contests when I was 10? Absolutely. Recommend, I'll give it a 4. I mean, if you want to understand the story of music, I think some Beach Boys got to be in here. I don't know about this album because obviously you can't get it and you got to have Alan's playlist, but a greatest hits, if this is available, yeah, I'd give it a 4. And overall, I'll give it a 3.5 only because just I think time and age, but I'll give it a full, a 5 for just respect and for what they did and where they took music, but overall 3.5.
Yeah, it is hard to score. But, I kept coming back to, this is an amazing collection of hits, of course. And it's funny, Alan, when you were just saying, like, you were born in the 80s and, you had this whole, in your explanation episode, talking about when you were in school and as a kid and all these other kids listening to the Beach Boys getting into it. But the crazy thing is, I mean, I'm 55 and these were before my time. So think of that influence. Like, it was second generation for me. I mean, really, it was 1961 to 67 was really the prime time. That was like all those early surfing songs, and then you get Pet Sounds in there in 67 or 66. And I mean, that's amazing. That body of work done in 5-6 years is still talked about. And Scott Gregory, you're a bit younger than me, and Scott, like, we are all influenced by the Beach Boys. And this is very, very old music, right? Like, so we're coming up on 60 some years. Like, oh my God, it's craziness. So you realize like just how good and the staying power that it has when you just have that kind of talent. And yeah, it's poppy, but I would recommend, and I mean, I'll give my scores here, but I think basically my scores are all 4s because I think I'd recommend it for, this is a classic collection of hits. Influential, absolutely. They're highly influential, but I'm only giving it 4 and 4 overall because I think you should just listen to Pet Sounds. If you really want to understand the Beach Boys, it is a huge departure from what they did. It's very complicated, very layered. There is jazz and classical composition all through this. Like, Brian Wilson spent so much time and developed this. They really made it a big, full sound. It was just a dynamite album. Like I said, I just recently listened to it, and it blew my mind. Like, seriously, and hey man, have you ever tried it on weed? Like that is always recommended. Smoke a joint, do an edible, whatever you got to do, get relaxed, put on that album and just zone out for, it's probably less than an hour. I don't remember the running time, but dynamite. That's the only reason I think I'm giving the other ones 4s, because I think you have to look at their whole work, and that is after the influence of the Beatles and the Sgt. Pepper album. This is what Brian Wilson did. I mean, unfortunately, I think drugs, mental illness, alcohol, a lot sidetracked him for many years after, and never quite did it. And even if you think, like I mentioned, that we're all influenced and the bulk of the work was 67. I mean, besides what Kokomo in 1988 on the Cocktail soundtrack, there really wasn't. You didn't hear a lot of new stuff from the Beach Boys. There was a long time, too, when Brian Wilson kind of extracted himself and all the other guys wrote the songs, and, God bless them, but, like, they just weren't Brian Wilson songs. And they tried their best. I have a couple of those albums here, and, they sound okay, but they're just not quite as good. He was really the genius behind the band. So, I went all 4s there, and, hey, it's amazing. Highly recommended. Definitely check out the Beach Boys. And like Alan said, it's good to go. Just plop yourself back in the seas, put on a few cheesy old 60s surfer movies, and just enjoy the ride. It's totally great. It's totally great. Scott Gregory.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. I think, influence for me is a 3. Personally, they influenced me in my youth. As Darren said, it's a generation behind us. I'm 50, so I'm, that far behind him, but definitely way off these guys. There is a literal full generation of people having kids between me and when this music came out. That being said, I really enjoyed it. And though, like I said, it's kind of like the Star Wars movies where it's not quite made for me. It's made enough for me. Some of those themes are timeless enough, and the artistry of the music is compelling enough that I honestly really did still enjoy it and still do. Some people my age experienced the Beach Boys by like Solid Gold Hits Volume 13 or whatever that they got in a gas station, and their parents played it in the car, and they're like, who are these guys? And then you go down a bit of a rabbit hole kind of thing, right? And I think it's still worth doing today as well, too. So if you haven't really listened to them before, like my influence is a bit jaded on that front. If you really haven't gone down that rabbit hole, consider the influence like a 4 or a 5, that it will change you a little bit to be able to go in and see. It's an artifact of a time gone by that I think you'll really enjoy. That being said, recommended for me is a 4. I think, Darren makes a compelling case to go check out a full album off of them, but I think some of these, were EPs and solos, and the only way to really consume them well would be to get a greatest hits like this as well too, and just get that double, triple, quintuple punch to the face of all the different styles that they go through, as far as the real beach blanket stuff to some of the crooning to what's, I guess, considered the heavier stuff for the Beach Boys, which seems weird to say coming out of my mouth. So with that in mind, overall, I'll give it like a 3.5, but that feels low. When I say it, just on a pure math perspective. Let me, caveat that by saying it's a 3.5, but if they're new to you, you honestly have to go down and listen to a bunch of their stuff and then make the decision for yourself. Alan.
Thanks, guys. Just to bring this full circle, it just occurred to me that the last album I ever bought before streaming took over was also a compilation album, also from a boy band. I bought the greatest hits album from the Backstreet Boys. So,
nice.
Full circle.
What?
Yeah. And now I just stream everything, and I have a Spotify playlist, which, by the way, if you didn't catch our intro episode of this, built a playlist that is called The Best of the Beach Boys Volume 2, because this album is now out of print. So if you are just tuning in now and you haven't heard this and you are inspired, just go to Spotify and look up The Best of the Beach Boys Volume 2, and you should see a fan-made playlist by me. But yeah, getting into scores, overall, I really enjoyed revisiting this album and exploring it from the lens of an adult who listens to albums and critiques them once a month with my friends. So that said, I haven't really deliberately listened to a Beach Boys song in a very, very long time. And in some ways it felt like a bit of a homecoming for me. It's just familiar. It's something I've always known, the sound of the Beach Boys, even though, again, I wasn't around in the 60s and I have never gone surfing USA. It's the anemoia, the nostalgia for a time I've never known. So yeah, 4 out of 5 overall. I think this is a short album full of catchy tunes. It works fine both as background music or music you actually want to pay attention to. As far as recommendations go, I'm going to give this a 4 out of 5, mostly because like Darren pointed it out too. Like this predated his generation. It certainly predated my generation. I am curious what Generation Z and younger would think of this album, and if they would get that same sense of nostalgia for a time they've never experienced. But, you know, leading into influence, I mean, guys, I'm influenced. I am going to smoke a J and listen to Pet Sounds. I also think the Beach Boys were very influential to other pop and rock groups over the years that I'm a fan of, some of whom I've mentioned before. So I think I have to give it a 4.5 out of 5. So all around a pretty solid album. And again, I'll admit my bias here. It was my pick and I grew up with this stuff. So, you know, rose-colored glasses and all that. But yeah, I think it was a good month. Listeners, we at the Sonic Collective are going to start doing something a little bit different. I think you're used to us teeing up our next pick with a whole independent podcast episode. And we've decided that we're just going to start merging the reviews and our selections into the same podcast. So if you have stuck around this far, stay tuned just a little bit longer because Scott Gregory is about to tee up his next pick. Over to you, buddy.
So yeah, guys, the next album, talk about going to a time that we have nostalgia for. I've decided that we are going to be doing 1991 Slave to the Grind by Skid Row. I was tempted to go with their 1989 debut album, Skid Row. It's got far more recognizable tracks, but I think it's really hard to distinguish them from other glam metal bands like Poison, Bon Jovi, and Warrant. I think their second album is where they really establish their own proper voice. They get a little heavier on this one and really close out the glam era strong in the face of grunge coming in to steal the show. So, you know, while I think the hits of all those bands I still mentioned still get some radio rotation, I think we all have a little certain soft spot for glam metal here. But I don't know how many of us, let alone the listeners, have heard tracks off this album. I really didn't recognize any of them, let alone the entire album. So I hope you guys and everyone listening get a little something new on their plate this month.
Once again, Scott Gregory, what is the name of that album?
Slave to the Grind by Skid Row, 1991.
All right, so stay tuned for next month when we listen to and review Scott Gregory's album pick. And once again, we're not going to have any more selection episodes. They're now just going to be one and the same. We will review our music and then stick around to the end where you can hear the next month's pick. So with that said, thank you all for tuning in if you've made it this far. I am Alan. And with me, as always, Darren Scott, Scott Gregory, and Scott Coates, signing off for the Sonic Collective.
Hey, thanks for joining us on the Sonic Collective, where we've explored the music, the history, and the impact of some of the greatest albums of all time. We hope you've enjoyed our discussions and gained new insights and appreciation for the music you and we love. Join us next month for another exciting album, and until then, keep listening to great music.